The stage is yours.
Thank you, Philip. Very nice welcome. We started 10 minutes late, and I worked for Germans, so I will claim 10 more minutes for this discussion because it's only 45 minutes. Okay. So you heard about me, but I think it's better to hear about these three wonderful people who are going to give you an amazing takeaway show on shared identities and whatever we are doing. So first will be David Crowley, who is from Dublin. He knows a lot about Central Europe. He's been frequently visiting this place along with his students. He's curator of architecture and a journalist. So that's David. Next to him is Olja, who, as you see, is a wonderful photographer. But not only that, she's also head of the Department of Photography and Media on VŠVU, Academy of Fine Arts in Bratislava. She has an amazing sense of humor coming from Balkans. And next to him is one of the most intelligent people I know with the most elaborate language ever, Samu. So he's going to talk like 5 minutes, one question. He's director of content for Contemporary Center of Architecture in Budapest. So before we go into this identity talk, David, you wrote a wonderful essay for the Atlas. Can you give us a brief keynote summary of what you were writing about?
Sure. So I'm just going to say a few words, but there are many more words in the essay that I wrote. And it's just to reflect a little bit on the kind of material legacy of the of architecture and urban planning in Eastern Europe under communist rule, what its legacy is post-89. So when we're thinking about architecture and the city, if we accept, and this is a question, but if we accept that there's something distinct about that material and intellectual environment before 1989, we could surely ask the question, not only what's left, but what could we retrieve from that past today? What might be useful about that distinct experience? And I say this because the attack that was made on socialist architecture and urbanism in the early 1990s was truly aggressive. I would have hated to have been a middle-aged architect in Eastern Europe in the mid-1990s because you were told that your buildings were poorly constructed. You were told that your buildings were mean, that they were meager, that they didn't give space to people. You would have been told that your buildings were wasteful, and maybe they were in terms of energy efficiency and so on. That the architecture that you were responsible for was characterless and it was asocial. It didn't produce a sense of place. And that it was polluted and dirty and it was polluting. At the same time as you were being told that, there was a massive privatization underway, which took all those assets which had once been held in common ownership and turned them into tradable goods, traded them as commodities. So we have got these two fronts, this negative image of architecture, the massive wholesale asset stripping that goes on. And then you have a third front, which is everybody's being told luxury is the future, private ownership of your home, the ownership of a car is the correct social aspiration to have. This is the 90s. And then underlying that is another discourse that tells you, now you're in this new world, you're not going to trust anything that's collective or common or social, because that's what was so badly managed before 1989. That public life, public space, public values had been inauthentic and mismanaged, and that really you should embrace the kind of privacy and individualism that the market will bring for you. So that's like the logic for gated communities. And all of those little facts I've just given you, I think, were very interconnected. I'm polemicizing a bit, but if you describe a building as failing, if you describe a whole generation of architectural work as being inadequate, it becomes the grounds on which you can justify the demolition of those buildings. And then you can turn that land back to the market. So that's the story of Super Sam, which was a celebrated, rather brilliant piece of engineering, architectural engineering in Warsaw that was made in the late 1950s by a super talented team of architects. First supermarket in the Eastern Bloc was destroyed because the logic of failing buildings meant that it was compelled to be so. And we could go through a list of buildings that suffered that fate, right? We go to Liberec, and we could think about the central department store that was there, which is now much better because it's Tesco's, right? It's clearly not. So we have this moment in the 90s where architecture of the pre-89 period is vilified. But then something happens about 10 years ago, which is a kind of complete discovery or a kind of rediscovery of the virtues of what we might call sots-modernist architecture, the modernism of the 60s and 70s. And that's partly reflected on the first essay, a rather good essay in this book on the sort of ruins of modernism. And I think a lot of those discoveries were simply to do with a kind of exoticization of rather dramatic buildings, sort of bespoke, highly engineered, one-off buildings that the state liked to produce, sports centers, telecommunication towers, and so on. These were spectacularized, often by photographers who saw a kind of exotic quality in them and turned them into a kind of socialist sublime or something we might call it. I'm not interested in that. But what I am more interested in is also the discovery of these buildings by people who actively wanted to engage in discussions about the public spaces in which they live. So that these sots-modernist, rather dramatic structures are somehow often adopted by activists, by architectural historians, by artists, as a way of creating a space for discussion around public space. And so a kind of pattern appears where you can see a developer threatens a building, a socialist era sots-modernist building, gets the support of local politicians, and then a kind of an alliance of local interests sets out to save those buildings. So you get a mixture of heritage groups. You've probably got people in this room who've been involved in these things. You'll have artists, and you'll also have anti-capitalist activists. And I can think of places like the Cracovia Hotel in Kraków, in Poland, which has gone through this and was the subject of amazing, lively campaigns, which involved art, but also involved putting a lot of information into the public sphere that was normally kept private, talking about the operations of the developers, talking about the financial investments that have been made. So these attempts to save these buildings is often not just about the architectural object, but it's about putting a kind of knowledge into the world that's often kind of switched off or closed off. Other things happen in this moment. Havířov, the railway station, really striking example of a group of local artists and architectural activists who decide to turn it into public space again. When the building is threatened, they turn it into a place for concerts, for children's workshops. They render that building as public space yet again. And in a way, I think what they wanted to do was to re-enchant that architecture that people had said for so long was a kind of failure of a failed political system. So that's kind of interesting. They clean the building literally. And Elka Krasny has a rather lovely discussion of what it means to clean a building in her essay. They also, I think, changed the kind of definition of what it means to operate architecturally. It really isn't about designing a new structure. It's about sustaining an existing one. It turns architects into something like activists or community organizers. And I think in a way, this is where I'm just sort of finishing, you could argue that these campaigns, often quite paradoxical, left-wing activists trying to save luxury hotels, seems kind of odd, that these campaigns maybe aren't really about the buildings, but they're about the production of a public, about the production of a counter-public. So I think I'll just leave it there. I've got lots more that I could say, but just because time is tight. It's a little snapshot of one way of thinking about a kind of legacy of that pre-1989 experience.
David, thank you. And Helena, it's a good move to ask the outsider to write about Central Europe, because I feel now like under X-rays, because you described brilliantly what we have been going through and linked it very nicely to architecture. But we are going to talk about shared identities. And identity is not only a building or a logo. Identity is a lifestyle. It's an action. It's the values that we share. And there is a clear distinction on 89 and the democratic regime, and that brings also nowadays this tension between generations of, for example, my parents or existing politician and new generation coming in claiming these luxurious hotels as some kind of, let's say, heritage. So my first question to all of you is like, what has shaped your personal view on sharing or public or commons, and whether this is different from view of your parents, And if you have clashes maybe over these definitions, like what is shared and what is public. So who dare to start?
Okay, just a quick note on what David has said. I think there's a way to, and maybe that will be a segue into the sharing issue, that ultimately you can also say that architecture is always about formalizing knowledge. And I think the public architecture of the socialist era, which is, and I agree, I think it tends to be more interesting when it's generic than when it's sort of striking and spectacular. It was produced without the knowledge attached to it. So what is lacking is the production of knowledge of the public, essentially from that era. So we don't have a tradition for sharing and the public in that sense, in such a sense that these buildings were providing opportunities for that. And I think it took the process of these several decades to kind of for these notions to reappear, maybe in a different generation. Maybe what you can see now is that, as always, the trends of, let's say, mid-century modern design that were, all over the place roughly a decade ago in interior design magazines and fashion magazines, they came into Central Eastern Europe with a few years late, and they've been huge in recent years. Everybody's going mid-century modernist without connecting it to Sotsmodernism, whilst Sotsmodernist buildings are being demolished. So, the interiors are sort of highlighted while the exterior is sort of being removed. So I think the question somewhere on sharing is this: what do we know? How do we know that thing as a generation or as several generations? How does architecture around us create affordances for that? And the successful examples of sharing connected with architecture from this period are precisely the ones where there was a community or some stakeholders who managed to create this knowledge as a shared knowledge of how, you can interpret it as a way of how you use this building, what this building creates as an opportunity, the generosity of public spaces in that, and the understanding, a very particular understanding of what the public is and how that could work. Of course, if you understand these buildings, you will also understand that the architects who designed them in the socialist era were often the least socialist of society. So these buildings in their visions of the public are very often absolutely pre-war bourgeois or conservative even, you could say. And in that sense, I think that also applies to sharing as a practice, back to your question. So I think there's a big difference between, let's say, the post-war boomer generation's understanding of sharing, which in the case of socialist countries is in a stark contrast to the boomer generations in the West, whereas here, I think there was sharing out of necessity and out of survival even, both in construction of family housing and in sharing limited resources and so on. And then, yes, the lure of private property and whether that's luxury or whether that's sort of the middle class life that they missed in their proper lifetimes is an ideal that drives many generations. And I think the sharing practices that are existing now and that might be in contrast to that are twofold. One is your well-known sharing as a lifestyle opportunity for relatively well-educated and relatively well-off middle classes in Eastern Europe, much the same as what you see anywhere around the sort of Western world. Mm-hmm. And then, again, we have the surviving modes of sharing out of necessity in the same cities very much, usually by marginalized groups of people. And their sharing, that's where sharing becomes a real issue, I think, if you look at the sustainability of sharing. And that's where it's also becoming much more problematic, because it represents a lifestyle that is not a choice and that is in stark contrast to the ideals that are shown in general culture.
Thank you very much. Olja, you were born into Yugoslavia. How was sharing at that time for your parents, and how is it for you now living in Bratislava?
Well, I was thinking how to actually answer this question, because it's really interesting, and I think I will be more maybe personal, because this shared identity of the city is really connected with my childhood, because as I was growing up in Vojvodina, which is multi-ethnic region, there is almost 25 different nationalities and 4 official languages. Every village was had a different architecture in place and a type of villages: Hungarian, Slovak, Romanian, Croatian, or different minorities. And in the same time, we faced this shared identity or identity of the architecture connected with completely different type, which was this building of the building identity of the country, which was very connected with this Yugoslavian identity. So we have these large cities that were made in late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that was connected with economy and with this Yugoslavian identity, and also with this migration within the country. So a lot of citizens was changing from the republic. So from Bosnia came to live after the Second World War, came to live to Serbia or in different ex-republics of Yugoslavia. And also that was very connected with this identity of the people, how they share these public spaces around the new places where they're supposed to live in this identity of Yugoslavian building and architecture, and now which was our heritage in the way museum heritage, because I think my childhood is a way of a museum thing to elaborate and to make this archaeology. And so within our identity and identity of the nation, we went a lot out and we shared these places because we needed to meet, and all those people came from the small villages, so they needed somewhere in the 70s and 80s to make the weddings, for example, or funerals, or even the Sunday barbecue, which is a part of us. So a lot of places were used by citizens. And now, and my generation, my parents, and also my generation as one of the last Tito's pioneers. But now, after the last war in Yugoslavia, I see the big apathy regarding the public space, which you can see maybe in some images of New Belgrade that I made, because a lot of people are facing the poverty and they don't have money, they're struggling the economic problems, so they don't care anymore about these public spaces. They are closing to themselves, and this generation that they used to go out, they are not doing anymore. And that is something that I found very interesting in comparing with Bratislava, what I see now as my second hometown after I emigrated from Serbia in '97, that how the Bratislava within becoming the EU, actually the youngest EU capital city within the European Union, changed this apathy regarding the public spaces. Because in my artistic research and exploring, I always focused on the spaces and the places and architecture, because I was looking actually my identity of myself. And I see how the Bratislava didn't care in 98 or 2000 about some public spaces coming from the socialistic part, because they were changing and they needed to move forward. But now with this economical growth and this stability in the cities, and with bigger budget, and with the awareness of the conscience about what the community can bring to the city, it changed completely. And that is something which I like in Bratislava, and what I miss, for example, in Belgrade or in Novi Sad, regarding the shared identity or shared public spaces.
Time is very scarce, but I still would like to use your external perspective. When you hear these Central European stories on sharing, can you compare it to sharing in Ireland or maybe generation of parents? Is there something similar, or is this completely different?
Well, I'm from Dublin, and in Dublin at the moment the housing crisis is off the scale. And I think the level of expectation that people should have housing provided for them is really quite low. One of the legacies that's probably worth testing a bit about the experience of communist rule was the set of social contracts that were made, which said you are entitled to housing. Now, we know that that housing wasn't always good and it wasn't provided, but it provided a space for a political discourse where a set of social norms and expectations could be put in place. And frankly, I still believe in those norms and expectations. I think one sense of sharing is the idea that we have common resources that we need to ensure allocated with justice, social justice. And I think post-89, that was eroded very, very rapidly. And I think if there was, I'm not nostalgic, but if there was a space for a renegotiation and a substantiation of an argument, it would be about what we expect and what we consider to be an acceptable minimum level of existence. In Dublin, children sleep on the street. That's not acceptable to me. Sorry, that was quite heavy, wasn't it? I apologize.
Thank you. Next question is about, let's go from history, like from the past to the nowadays. And as you mentioned, we were turning our back on the socialist buildings, but also not only the whole building, our whole system. Suddenly we wanted to be antithesis of what was happening, including privatization. But yet, is there something that you consider to be very positive from this era, let's call it communism or socialism, something that we can take on into now and even protect it? Can you see something that we can build upon? Samu, you are the... I'm pointing at you because I think you will give me a very good answer.
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. If you ask an architect, no, I mean professionally or cultural context-wise, because architects were fighting very aggressively for this heritage all throughout these decades, in recent decades, because precisely because they said that, or at least one of the narratives was that the architecture from this era did indeed put forward some thesis about what public life should be about, and especially in socialist countries or countries where planning institutions were operating with relative independence, there was an exceptional degree of independence for architects to work on their visions without much of a client's influence. So a lot of public architecture in socialist countries is actually architecture that would have been unimaginable in Western countries just because of the way it was designed and built. That's one thing. The other thing is how, of course, most architects operating in socialist countries in the socialist era were actually modernist trained architects. So a lot of what came out of the pre-war avant-garde and modernist schools of thought and schools of architecture was actually built in reality in the socialist era in socialist countries. And I could continue. So I think there's a lot of, if you ask an architect, I mean, this seems an obvious answer to most architects in these countries. If you ask the public, I think it's a radically different answer that you might get. But it's one that's changing now, as just like David said. I think that some of that is trends and fashions. Some of that is new generations who don't subscribe to a vision of the city, or I'm hesitant to talk about national identities or whatsoever, but who don't associate themselves necessarily with the historic concept or with history per se as a necessity for an acceptable position in life. If you know what I mean. I mean, you don't have to be in the medieval town square or the historic part of a capital city to feel an authentic way of being embedded in culture. So, and for these generations, modernism or post-war modernism it can be shown as an interesting choice without the baggage of socialist oppression or whatever. So I think there's a range of answers, and it's more about who's able to communicate about that to the others and who can open this up to the others, what you get as a result.
Thank you very much. I will catch up on architecture and public space. Olja, you've been through these 7 cities. You were taking pictures without any proposal, so it was your intuition and your interpretation of what you want to show us. Do you find any, let's say, similarities between these cities in terms of this post-Soviet architecture and any kind of infrastructure connected to public life? Between Belgrade and Berlin are rather different.
Well, yeah, as I said, when we launched the book Atlas, I said that I put myself in the position of the walker and the observer, and I started to walk all around the 7 cities. And what I found interesting, that I started to look maybe for my personal city, because I started to look something familiar, what was for me in Warsaw when I found a big monument so far away from the downtown, or in Berlin when I saw the housing and the playgrounds. And I found very connected how they made the playgrounds and the chairs for sitting and relaxing from next to the buildings where people could come, sit and talk and just enjoy the time on the concrete benches, which are very nice to sit on them. And so I found this connection between maybe more in these public spaces next to the housing parts of the city, like in Belgrade or in Berlin, the East Berlin, and it's and also how the large buildings, for example, made for banks or for shopping malls during the socialistic time, were shaping the identity also and memories of the people. So everybody can say who was born in that, how they went, for example, with parents in this bank, or like in Yugoslavia there was a Ljubljan bank, or in some shopping mall. So I found this interesting, how some memory is connected with these public spaces.
Thank you very much. Let's stay in nowadays, in presence, because next question is about future already. So our generation, or like now, I see it's layers of different attitudes, emotions. Samu, you said it's variety of answers, and I think this is exactly what identity is. It's a multiply, like dialogue of angles. And nowadays we live in era which is not communistic or collectivist. There is a strong emphasis on individualism, but yet we share because we can share sometimes. Question for you, David. I use the question that you leave at the end of your essay. What tools are required to encourage spaces to be shared in viable and fulfilling ways for now, for us, individualists, at the same time desiring to share?
Yeah, I'm not an architect, so I don't have a set of tools.
Well, that's why you are here. You don't want only architects around here.
But I'm kind of interested in the capacity for spaces to be many things at the same time. And I think it's kind of problematic that those interests that control a lot of space are interested often in limiting the kind of behaviors in those spaces in very particular ways, you know, so that when we move through our cities, we're expected to orientate ourselves as consumers. We know that increasingly retail environments will behave in particular ways. We know that street furniture, which is discussed really interestingly in this atlas, is increasingly owned by advertising agencies and working in concert with city authorities, doing everything that they can to stop the homeless from having access to those spaces and so on. So if we really believe in sort of plurality, the capacity of somehow being together but being different, we need spaces which allow for those differences to sit side by side.
Thank you very much. If you want to add something, you can. Otherwise, I move you a little bit further, or it's actually dialogue of nowadays, because now we have new topics which are also shaping the way how we are dealing with resources, like climate change or climate adaptation, or the social gaps which are widening. So there are like rich and poor, and somehow those resources are being distributed from middle class to up. Where do you see some good models, tools, or thoughts for sharing, considering these new challenges for us in our cities? And this is a question that I pose to all of you, or anybody who desires to answer that. But I guess Samu would be the good option. He's always the good icebreaker.
Well, I guess this is what we were all working on, no? Weren't we, in this project? So I guess the easiest answer is to look at what we accomplished here. And I'm not sure there's a good answer to this question, in a sense that I'm not sure there are practices that are original or I don't know, local and specific in this sense, or could even be seen as working everywhere in the same way. But the general answer would be whenever there's a community that has an ability to learn, that would be a successful practice, whatever they do. Because I think one of the key challenges here in this region is the refusal of many communities to learn. Because to learn is to expose yourself to risks. And that's precisely what most people would and had to, for very good reasons, avoid for many decades to be successful. And I think this appears on the level of city administration. This appears on the level of local communities and individuals as well. And I think it's difficult. If you look at one of the typical typologies in this region is the Mietshaus. So the tenement building with the central courtyard, 3 floors or 4 floors, better apartments facing the street, worse apartments facing the courtyard, and then various communities and people living together, which is basically an ideal mix, if you will. On the other hand, the other shared experience from this region is the complete unmanageability of this tenement housing. No matter what the legislation, and no matter what the association models for managing multi-owner tenement buildings where each apartment is owned by someone else, the shared experience is that it's just completely impossible. And somebody starts to put out, I don't know, a split climb, what you call this, the air conditioner, and then it proliferates across the whole facade, and no matter, it's going to worsen the climate of the building, it's going to have a noise. It's extremely difficult to get to a decision where we say, no, we're not going to do that, we're going to do something else. And that's the question of your ability to learn or not to learn. And I think there are sort of splinters of answers, but I wouldn't be able to say there's, a very good practice of doing this or that. Sometimes it's a fringe thing. So, geek communities operating on blockchain, trying to solve something, or another community coming up with a management model for a public square involving the businesses. And in any case, I think these have to be both visionary and practical. So what I'm really usually very critical of is talking about sharing as an ideology. I think if you see sharing as a practice, that is a workable practice, that's where the success is.
You want to cut us off or what? We still have some minutes.
You just have to come to an end. Maybe the last question to some.
But we started 10 minutes late. It's not fair.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so last question, because this is extremely important. It's learning. Don't take it for ideology, economical, political, whatever. And it basically comes actually to tolerance. So maybe my last question will be then, maybe we are not talking about sharing. Maybe it's also about like learning or public or commons. Like, where do you see these terms in the future? How should we understand them? So it's not only a buzzword. That's a philosophical question, David.
I mean, the discussion is super empathetic, right? It's about asking us to imagine the other and to, if you've got a problem with the air conditioning, perhaps you behave better if you understood the consequence for your neighbor. My view is slightly dark. I think that humans are very self-interested, as we can see all around us. And, we've been talking about architecture of the communist era, but we knew that this was a very corrupted form of communism. But it strikes me that in the future, we might seriously have to embrace an authentic, an ideal form of communism, because we won't have the resources to be able to allow everybody to live at the kind of, with the ambition and the voraciousness that they would want. So we're going to have to control resources. And we're going to need to have some kind of system of management of those resources that is based on sort of social justice. And we need to use technology for the common good. And we need to be able to kind of serve people, not to serve profit. So we might have to, in some years in the future, properly imagine a real communist architecture.
Thank you, Olja. The future of public sharing?
Well, invest in education, be open in new possibilities and forms, and not to be afraid of new functions of the old buildings, and to talk more and to open dialogue more with the developers in the cities.
Your colleagues from Warsaw are shaking the head in your agreement. Okay, Samu.
Quick answer. I think technology is something we haven't talked about, and most of the business models and operational models of urban spaces and publics or sharing will be driven by technologies. So we're not looking at architecture, we're looking at technologies and successful business models there. The other thing is, this is something which I wanted to say at this platform. Maybe it's not it's not a good way to end this discussion, but you will see that. So when we started this project 4 years ago, we had, of the participating countries, these were sort of democracies with challenges, let's call it this way. Now we're in 2019, and some countries of the participating partners have become, modestly I could call it, hybrid authoritarian regimes. So I think this is something which we haven't talked about, but which is, I think, extremely important when you talk about the future possibilities of sharing. And just reflecting on what David said, one way to look at it is you could say that, yes, there should be some form of organized redistribution of resources, call it communism or something else in the future, in order to sustain ourselves. But if you look at this part of the world, there's also an answer which might be cynical and which I don't necessarily endorse myself, but the tendency to return to authoritarian rule is also a way to return to something that seems sustainable in this part of the world. And I think that's something that we need to think about very hard, why that's the case and what's the thing that makes this popular and sustainable, which is essentially a way to redistribute resources in education, in public spaces, in the operation of cities and so on. And that's a big problem, I think, without any pluses or minuses, but that's something to think about. And I think that if you look at the partners here and you look at the context where we have worked, this is very immediate. It's not an abstract thing.
Thank you very much for this. It's dark note, but it's reality, and I hope we can work somehow constructively with it. Thank you, Philip, for letting us to answer this question. Ladies and gentlemen, first discussion on shared identity is beyond us. Please warm applause for all three of them. They were extremely good and on the time.